Shavua Tov. So we'll start now on Tzadi Omid Beis, the Mishnah, and hopefully we'll be able to do this entire Mishnah, and we'll see how far we can get. So the Mishnah on Daf Tzadi Omid Beis deals with what's called Kidima, which carbon comes first. Kol achatos shebatorah kodmos liashomos. The chatos comes before the carbon asham, with a few exceptions. And the reason for that is because the avoda of the chatos is much more complex and requires more than the asham in terms of the matan dam. Chutz me'asham mitzora. But in the case of the mitzora, who has to bring both a chatos and an asham, the asham comes first. And why is that so? Mipnei shehu ba al hechsher. It means that the mitzora wants to re-enter society after he terminates his tumah, and the clincher for that is his carbon asham. So we want the carbon asham to come first. So normally when you bring a chatas and an asham at the same time, the chatas takes precedence because it is a complicated matan domim on all four corners of the mizbeach, whereas the asham only needs two. The exception is the case of mitzora because when he undergoes tahara and he has to bring an asham, a chatas, and an ola, the asham should be brought first. And the reason for that is that the entire process of tahara really depends on the asham. The dam of the asham is going to be placed on his thumb, his right ear, and his big toe. So that's really going to bring him back to the state in which he can eat kodshim, and therefore we want to start with the carbon asham. The Mishnah continues. Kol hasham shebator b'nei shtayim. We have to wait till the animal is a minimum of 2 years old before we can bring the carbon asham. Uboin b'kesef shkolim, and it has to have a value on the market of at least a minimum of 2 shkolim. However, there are two exceptions to this rule. Chutz me'asham nozir v'asham mitzora. We already mentioned the asham mitzora. The asham nozir, again, is going to be the carbon asham that the nozir brings at the termination of his nazirus. And hein boin b'nei shnatan v'ein boin b'kesef shkolim. So instead of a 2-year-old, it's within the first year. The animal is not even a year old, and not only that, the requirement of 2 shkolim as a minimum for the value of the asham does not apply, neither in the case of the asham mitzora nor in the case of the asham nozi. The Mishnah continues, Kishem shekodmin ba'kravosam, kodmin ba'achilosam. So the halach of Kedima, says the Mishnah, applies not just to the avodas hakorban, but also to the achilas hakorban, because the achila is part of the process of kapara, v'achlo osam asher kupar bahem, and therefore the rules and the priorities that apply to the akrova, to the avoda, also likely apply to the achila, insofar as the achila is part of the avoda. So therefore, if under normal conditions, not only will the avodas hachatos be implemented before the avodas ha'asham, but even the achilas hachatos takes precedence over the achilas ha'asham. Shlomim shel emesh u'shlomim shel yom. What happens in a case where the carbon shlomim, which has a 2-day allotment, passed its first day into its second day? And then he has another additional carbon shlomim, and this is the first day, the day of the carbon shlomim. So the Mishnah paskins that shel emesh kodmim l'shel yom, since the korban was already, we'll call it shlomim number one, was already brought yesterday, then it's a pressing need, and we give preference to that korban of yesterday today. And the Gemara is going to go into a long discussion about this, different kinds of interpretations. Now, how could it be that the korban was brought yesterday? What happens to the dam? So we're going to have to assume that the dam was given over to a Kohen limores. Mores means he continues to stir it so it doesn't become congealed. Otherwise it becomes dam shenikrash, which is posel. Shlomim shel emesh and chatos v'yoshem shel hayom. But what about a case where you have yesterday's shlomim, where the hakrova was not achieved yesterday, so it was delayed till today, but at the same time, you have now a chatos v'yoshem of today. Chatos v'yoshem takes precedence over shlomim because kodshi kodshim comes before kodshim kalim. So now you have a conflict between two principles. One principle is that yesterday's korban is urgent today and gets preference, but on the other hand, chatos v'yoshem gets preference over shlomim. So Mishnah Paskins like the second possibility, that in this case, the chatos v'yoshem will take precedence. Shlomim shel emesh kodmim. No, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I read only part of the Mishnah instead of the whole Mishnah. Right. So the Mishnah is saying that no, that even though normally chatos v'yoshem comes before shlomim, but in this case there's an urgent need to be makriv, to do the avodah of the shlomim, because he already started it yesterday, and that's called shlomim shel emesh kodmin. So what I told you before, I jumped the gun a little bit by leaving out Rabbi Meir, and I went straight to the Chachamim, Omrim, Chatos Kodemes Mipnei Kodshe Kodshim, that even though it's yesterday's Shlomim, but nevertheless the Chatos takes precedence, and will still continue to delay the Shlomim till after we finish the Avodas HaKorban Chatos. So it's only Rabbi Meir who says that the urgency of Shel Emesh overcomes the normal preference of Chatos, or Chatos V'Yosham, but now we're mentioning the Shita the Chacham against Rabbi Meir, that despite the fact that it's Shlomim Shel Emesh, nevertheless we apply the general rule that Osham, and for that matter Chatos, comes before Shlomim. Now, he has a note here that this applies to the achila of the shlomim. So that the 2-day allotment of achila in the case of shlomim means that if the achila of the shlomim was delayed by a day, which is okay, there's no nosar because you get another day for achila shlomim, but now he has today's chatos v'yosham. And that's the case where the chachamim insist that we do that which is mekudash yoser, which means the kodshe kodshim has a higher level of kedusha than shlomim, which is only kodshim kalim. And this despite the fact that the hakrova of the shlomim was yesterday's hakrova. And of course, Asham is also, he points out here, which we know is Kodshe Kodshim. The Chulon, says the Mishnah, you're talking about all these preferences, which gets priority, and so forth and so on. So let's say that the Kohanim are showing l'shanos b'achilosam. You're talking about the achila of the carbon. There are many different ways in which you can eat the carbon, prepare the basar carbon for the achila of the Kohanim. For example, ochlam tzluyim, he could prepare it by roasting it. Shlukim, he cooks it. Mivushalim is a normal cooking, whereas shlukim is when it's really almost overcooked. And the Kohanim have their prerogative to eat the basar carbon in any way, any shape, fashion they desire. Not only that, but they're also free loses litocho tavli chulin. They can put spices that are chulin and add it to the. You might think that you can't add chulin to kodshim, but nevertheless, and that might be the shita of Reb Meir, we'll see, but nevertheless, we're holding now by like Reb Shimon, and you're allowed to put these tavlin of chulin in to eat it with the basar of kodesh, and tavline truma, and you could also add spices of truma. Because normally, if you have truma, you can't lower its level, but by adding it to kodshim, says Reb Shimon, you're raising its level, and therefore it's okay to mix the tavlin shel truma with the basar kodshim. But Rabbi Meir, on the other hand, says, Lo yitein l'tocha tavli truma, shel yaves ha-truma lidei psul. Now, what happens is, with the basar kodesh, then always, without exception, you're limited in the amount of time you're allowed to eat the basar kodesh, whether it's one day in the case of kodesh kodshim, whether it's 2 days in the case of shlom, but be that as it may, there's always a limitation, and if you go over that limitation, then it becomes nosar. So Rabbi Meir doesn't want to take truma, which could be eaten for the rest, for the rest of till eternity, and limit it in the amount of time that you can eat it by adding the tavlin shel truma into the basar kodshim. And what's going to happen is, if he doesn't eat all the basar kodshim, then the basar kodshim will become nosar, and now the tavlinim of truma will not be eaten. It'll be brought to the base hapsul. That's where they put all the karbanas hapsulim. So Rav Meir doesn't want to expose us to such a possibility, and don't put truma, therefore, into a situation which increases the potential for disqualification. Therefore, truma spices may not be used to season offerings of basar kodshim. The Gemara asks, "Boilahu tadir umakudosh ezim mehen koden." We have two modus operandis of kedima. We have the kedima of tadir, which we learned about on daf peites, and then we have the kedima of kodesh. That kodesh comes first. So, which is greater, tadir or kodesh? And this question of the Gemara will apply, as we'll soon see, even beyond the confines of Kodshim. For example, Kiddush on Friday night requires Bori Pri Agofen, requires Mekadesh HaShabbos. The bracha Mekadesh HaShabbos is more Mekudosh than Bori Pri Agofen, but on the other hand, it's less frequent, because Bori Pri Agofen as a Birchas Hanenim is Tadir. So you have Tadir versus Mekudosh. So I'm just pointing out that as the sugya unfolds, we're going to see that this conflict and this outstanding issue is not limited to kodshim. So the Gemara now explains the two tzadim of the suffix. One side is to say tadir kodem mishum de tadir. Right, tadir is very, very important, gives a special high-level status. Or odilma mekudesh kodem de kodesh. The fact that it has a greater kedusha is equally a profound strength to the mekudosh. Toshma, our Mishnah at the beginning of Perek Asiri says Tmidim Kod Musafim. Now the Gemara is going to assume now that the Korban Musaf has a greater Kedusha insofar as it's generated by Kedusha Shabbos, whereas Tamid is during the week and on Shabbos, but I mean also during the week. But clearly, Tmidim are Tadir because the Korban Tamid is brought twice a day. Now we start today's Daf Tzadi Aleph, and the Mishnah continues, V'afal gav de musafim kedishe. So the Korban Musaf has the extra element of Kodesh, insofar as it's generated by Kedusha Shabbos, and the Korban Tamid has the extra status or yichus of Tadir. It's brought every day, and Tadir trumps Kodesh. Gemara rejects it. What are you telling me? You're telling me that the Korban Tamid does not have Kedusha Shabbos? Otu Shabbos l'musafim ahani l'tmidim lo ahani? The Korban Tamid of Shabbos is different than the Korban Tamid the whole week long, because the Korban Tamid of Shabbos is now integrated into Kedusha Shabbos, and there's a Chalos Kedusha Shabbos on the Korban Tamid, and therefore we have both the Korban Musaf, which is Kodesh, and the Korban Tamid of Shabbos, which is Kodesh, and now that equals out, and the Kosva Shlishi is going to be the fact that the Tamid is Tadir. But therefore, you don't have any proof in general that Tadir will trump Kodesh, because we're talking about a case where the Tadir itself is Kodesh. Toshma, let's bring a proof. Musafei Shabbos Kod Musafei Rosh Chodesh. Now let's point out that the Musafim of Shabbos are Tadir vis-a-vis the Talmud of Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is once a month. Shabbos is 4 times a month. So Shabbos has the extra element of Tadir. But the Gemara holds now that the Kedusha of Rosh Chodesh, in a certain kind of strange way, is even greater than the Kedusha of Shabbos. Meaning the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh is Kodesh Yoser than the Musaf of Shabbos. Now, I'm not sure why that's so. He says, in the name of Rashi and the Shita Mekubetzes, that Rosh Chodesh is called a Moed. That's based on a pasuk in whatchamacallit, in Eicha. Now, the Korban Musaf of Rosh Chodesh is also a Chatos, whereas the Musaf of Shabbos has no element of Chatos at all. There's no element of Chet in the Musaf of Shabbos. And as we've said over and over again, Chet and Kapora and Ritzui adds a certain Kedusha to the Korban. So paradoxically, even though Musaf has Shabbos, which is a greater Kedusha than Rosh Chodesh, but nevertheless the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh is a greater Kedusha, and that's because it's called a Moed, and it gets a status of a Chatos. Or shall we say it's brought together with a Chatos. And yet, despite the fact that the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh is Kodesh Yoser than the Musaf of Shabbos, nevertheless, the Musaf of Shabbos, insofar as it's Tadir, will trump the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh and get preference. Gemara says, I don't get it. You're assuming that you have a choice of Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos, meaning that it's a case where there's an overlap of Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos, like this coming Shabbos. It's going to be Rosh Chodesh, Teves, and Shabbos, obviously. And therefore, the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh is to be viewed as a separate entity. But that's not so. Why? Because Otu Rosh Chodesh lemusafim didei ahani lemusafei Shabbos lo ahani. Does that status of Rosh Chodesh only applies to the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh and not to the Musaf of Shabbos? That Shabbos is also Rosh Chodesh. So the Rosh Chodesh element generates a new upgrade status to the Musaf of Shabbos. It's no longer just a Musaf of Shabbos, it's a Musaf of Rosh Chodesh of Shabbos. In other words, the day itself is now imbued with the inherent Kedusha of Rosh Chodesh, not just the Kedusha of Shabbos. So the day itself is going to impact on the Musaf and makes the Musaf into Kodesh like Rosh Chodesh. And therefore, once again, as we saw earlier, we're going to apply the principle of Tadir, V'Sheinu Tadir, Tadir Kodem, like we did to the case of the Tmidim of Shabbos, because the Tmidim of Shabbos have the generated and upgraded by the Shabbos. So too, the Musaf of Shabbos is generated by and upgraded by the Kedusha of Rosh Chodesh. So therefore, we don't have any proof at all. Toshma, let's try another possibility. And the Mishnah says, Musafi Rosh Chodesh, Kod Musafi Rosh Hashanah. Now let's think about that. In the case of Rosh Chodesh, we have Tadir, but in the case of Rosh Hashanah, we have Kodesh. Because clearly, although in the expanded definition of Moadim, you could include Rosh Chodesh as a Moed, but the real Moed is the Moed that has an Isra Malacha, has Mitzvah Hayom. In the case of Rosh Hashanah, it has Shofar and so forth and so on. All this is a result of the higher grade Kedusha of Rosh Hashanah. The Afagad Rosh Hashanah Kadesha, nevertheless, we're going to give preference to the Musafim of Rosh Chodesh. Because again, every Rosh Hashanah is also Rosh Chodesh. It's Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. And the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh that's brought on Rosh Hashanah is Tadir. Again, the Gemara is going to reject it for the same logical reason. Altu Rosh Hashanah l'musafi tidei ahani l'musafi Rosh Chodesh lo ahani. Is it not so that the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh, in this case of Tishrei, is upgraded to a high level of Kedusha by the fact that it is also a day of Rosh Hashanah? The day itself impacts on the nature and the essence of the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh and makes it into a Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. You know, it's the element of Rosh Hashanah, and that Kiddush Sayom is now penetrated, so to speak, into the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. And therefore, we have Kodesh and Kodesh. And again, the Kosva Shlisha Akri Beinayim is that Rosh Chodesh is Tadir. Let's try another possibility. Toshma, a brisa that says, and now we're talking about Kiddush. Remember I said at the outset that these issues of what comes first, Kodesh or Tadir, apply way beyond the confines of Kodesh. So now we have the Borei Pri Agofen and the Mekadesh HaShabbos, the two brachos. Which bracha comes first? So this is a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Our sugi is going like Beis Hillel, that Borei Pri Agofen comes first. Now, Borei Pri Agofen is Tadir. Again, Tadir in this context is a little bit tricky because usually the word Tadir means it has a specific time period. There's no specific time for Borei Pri Agofen. I could take out a cup of wine now and make a Borei Pri Agofen anytime. However, the concept of Tadir means, in this context, shchiach. Shchiach meaning it happens very frequently. It's not limited like the Birkas Mekadesh HaShabbos, which is only on Shabbos. Now, Beis Hillel say that you make the bracha Borei Pri Agofen first, meaning that even though the Mekadesh HaShabbos is a bracha that's imbued with the Kedushas HaShabbos, and therefore it's more Kodesh than Borei Pri Agofen, but nevertheless, since Borei Pri Agofen is Tadir, Tadir overcomes Kodesh. Birchas Yayin Tedira, Birchas Hayom Eina Tedira. Right, the Mekadesh HaShabbos relative to Borei Pri Agofen is infrequent. And therefore, Tadir V'Sheinu Tadir Kodem. That Afal Gav de Birchas Hayom Kadisha, it has a greater Kedusha than Borei Pri Agofen, but nevertheless, it's going to have to kowtow to Borei Pri Agofen because Borei Pri Agofen is Tadir. See, the Tadir Mekudesh, Tadir Kodem. So Gemara again rejects it. Otu Shabbos Birkas Hayom Ahani Birkas Hayayin Lo Ahani. This is not just a regular bar priyagofen. This is not just somebody who wants to drink a cup of wine. This is generated by the mitzvah of Kiddush and the Kiddush Hayom of Shabbos. So the bar priyagofen here is integrated into the series of brachos that make up Kiddush that reflect and have a Kedusha that's generated by the Kedusha Hayom. So therefore, the Bar Priyagofen, like the Mekadesh Shabbos, has the equal Kedusha level, and therefore we're going to apply the principle of Tadir Toshma. Now we're going to prove, until now we were dealing with Mishayis and Bryce, now we're dealing with an Amor. Rabbi Yochanan Omer, Halacha Mispal Adam Shel Mincha V'Yakach Shel Musaf. Let's say, for example, instead of praying the Musaf Tefillah in the morning of Shabbos, he delayed it, and now it's the afternoon. Now it's time for the tefillah of mincha. So which should come first now, Musaf or mincha? Rabbi Yochanan says that in such a case, mincha comes first because mincha is tadir, even though the korban Musaf and the tefillah of Musaf that replaces the korban, has a greater level of kedusha than mincha. Mincha is basically the same mincha that we daven the whole week long, but the Gemara again is going to reject it. You're saying that Musaf has a higher status of Kodesh because of Shabbos, and then you're saying the mincha is like a regular mincha the whole week long, on a secular day. That's not so. This mincha is the mincha of Shabbos. And I wonder, again, I'm just thinking out of the box now for a minute, whether or not this sugya that we're learning here about mincha on Shabbos touches on the question of what happens if a person mistakenly davened a regular weekday mincha on Shabbos. Is he Yotzei or is he not Yotzei? And if you would have asked me, I would say he is Yotzei. But now that I see this Gemara, I'm thinking that out loud that maybe he's not Yotzei because this is not a regular mincha. This is not the same as the mincha he davens on Sunday to Friday. This is the mincha of Shabbos, and that mincha is upgraded to a new status. The tefillah itself is a tefillah of Shabbos. It's not the tefillah of the weekday that happens to coincide with Shabbos. Toshma, let's try another possibility. Shlomim shel emesh, chatos v'yoshim shel yom. So as we said before, he's got the basar of the shlomim from yesterday, but he has another day of allotment for eating, and he's got a chiyuv to bring now a chatos or an osham. And the Mishnah Paskin, shlomim shel emesh kodmin. Now, shlomim shel emesh is not tadir, but it's similar to tadir. The Gemara is making that analogy and claiming that although chatas and osham have a greater kedusha than shlomim, which that we know because chatas v'osham is kodshei kodshim, shlomim is only kodshim kalin, but nevertheless, shlomim is going to take precedence. Ha'idi di'idi diyom chatas v'osham k'dodmi afal gav d'shlom tediri. So the halacha of the Mishnah is, the ruling of the Mishnah is that osham and chatas, despite the fact that what? That they have a greater kedusha than shlom is kodshei kodshim. And despite the fact that shlomim is called tadir, so you have tadir against kodesh. Nevertheless, the Mishnah paskins that chatas v'yoshim kodmi. So you see that Kodesh overrides Tadir. Now, why is Shlomim called Tadir? So maybe we could add the following. Chatas v'yoshim einam boim b'nedava. You can't voluntarily bring a chatas v'yoshim. Either you're chayav or there's no carbon. But Shlomim lends itself to a carbon nidava. You can optionally, voluntarily take it upon yourself to bring a carbon shlom. That makes it more tadir than a carbon that has to be generated in the case of chatas v'yoshim, either by sin or by tumah or completing your naziris, whatever the case might be. Let's just see if he adds anything. Yeah, that's all. So again, let's just, before we see Rava's shlagav, where are we holding now? We're holding now that even though Shlomim is considered Tadir because it's Babin and Dava, nevertheless Chatas v'Yoshim get Kedima because Kodesh overrides Tadir. Omar Rava, Matsui Ka'amrit. Shlomim is not Tadir. Your whole basis for your argument, the premise that you're operating with, is incorrect. Shlomim is not called Tadir. It's Matsui, but it's not Tadir. Matsui means it's common in the sense that you can, at any moment of any day, you could voluntarily accept upon yourself to bring a Shlomim. But nevertheless, it's not Tadir. Tadir means it has a specific time. Like, for example, we spoke about the carbon tamid. Morning, Bein Arbayim, you have to bring carbon tamid. But although the Kodesh of Asham and Chatos will override the Matsui of Shlomim, that's because Shlomim is not Tadir. It's not on that high level. It doesn't have that high-powered Kedima power of Tadir. Tadir kami boilah. Our suffix is which is greater, Kodesh or Tadir. The fact that, Matsui is overridden by Kodesh, lo kami boilah. We never asked that question. So we can certainly agree and concede that Kodesh overrides Matsui, but how do we know if Kodesh overrides Tadir? Now, Rava's premise here is that Tadir and Matsui are two fundamentally different concepts. One could argue against Rava that the fact that it's Matsui itself makes it Tadir. Any extra status and power that you inject into Tadir can be injected into Matsui. Matsui is not considered Tadir, doesn't rate as Tadir. I'm going to prove to you from a brisa with regard to Korban Pesach that Matsui is greater, it has the same status, that great status, as Tadir. Because the brisa says, with regard to a person who violated a chiv kares b'shogi and he has to bring a korban chatos, otzi es ha-pesach she'eno Tadir, v'lo otzi es ha-mila shehi tedira. Now watch what's happening here. Mila is going to take preference over the Korban Pesach. Why? Because Mila is called Tadir, or in feminine, Tedira. Now, although I agree that Korban Pesach is once a year, but if you want to generate, according to Rava's logic, a status of Tadir to Mila, you have to tell me that there's going to be a Mila on, take out a calendar and say, on this day there'll be a Mila, this day. That's not so. Although it's more shchiach, but it's not Tadir. And yet, the brisa says that if a person didn't yet bring the Korban Pesach, he's going to do the Mila first. Why? Because Mila is Matsui. Why is Mila Matsui? Not that it has Zman Kavua, but that it is more shchiach. It's more prevalent. So you see clearly from this brisa that Matsui is upgraded to the status of Tadir, and that's why Mila will push off the Korban Pesach. And the Gemara rejects it. My Tedira, you're misunderstanding. The brisa didn't mean, when it used the word Tedira referring to Mila, that it's technically defined as Tadir. No. The word Tedira has a more generic meaning. Tedira b'mitzvos. Every mitzvah in the Torah is mentioned once, in a few exceptions twice. The mitzvah of Mila is repeated in the Torah no less than 13 times. 13 different places in Scripture does the Torah mandate Mila. So the Mila is like 13 mitzvahs in one. Again, if we're counting mitzvahs, we'll count it as one. But in terms of how many times the Torah mandates you to do the Mila, it's 13 times. And that upgrades it to a new status vis-a-vis Korban Pesach. Now keep in mind, Mila and Korban Pesach, in a sense, form a set. They're related to each other because there's only two cases in all of the Torah where if you violate non-fulfillment of a mitzvah, say you get kares, and those are Mila and Korban Pesach. So in a certain sense, the chumrah of Mila and the chumrah of Korban Pesach are equal. But no, the Brisa is going to establish that there's a special status of Mila vis-a-vis Pesach because Mila is a mitzvah that's repeated 13 times in the Torah. And that's called Tedira b'mitzvahs. And he adds here, this indicates that circumcision is of paramount importance. Okay, fine. Iboy Seiman Aligmarog wants to offer an alternative explanation as to why Mila is upgraded to the status of Tadira. Mila Gabi Pesach ki Tadir Damya. In other words, if you compare Shlomim to Chatas and Ola, or Chatas and Osham, all right, it's true that on occasion a person will take upon himself voluntarily to bring a Shlomim. But it's not like built into nature. You can't assume that people right, left, and center are going to start voluntarily accepting upon themselves to bring a shlamim. So when I compare shlamim to chatas and asham, maybe you could fetch it's a little bit more tadir. Not so in the case of Mila. The case of Mila, when you're comparing it to Korban Pesach, is way, way more frequent. Every male child that's born in Israel will get Mila in the 8th day. Whereas Korban Pesach is once a year. The Gemara is a suffix, Tadir v'she'eno tadir v'kadam v'shachet l'she'eno tadir. This is the next suffix in the Gemara that's going to bring us all the way to the Mishnah here. And that is what happened in a case where he mistakenly began with the Eino Tadir. He should have started with the Tadir. But he shechted the Eino Tadir. So it's like, say, for example, we said that the Korban Tamid is Tadir and the Korban Musaf is Eino Tadir. But he went ahead mistakenly and he shechted the Korban Musaf. What do? We tell him, freeze it, and let's push off the Musaf until after we do the Tamid. Mi'amrin came into Shachtei Makrav. Should we say no? He already started the Avodah. He messed up on the law of Tadir Kodem, but let him finish. Oh, Dilma, should we say no? Yoev li Acher, let him give over the dam to another Kohen. Mimores Bidomo, and the other Kohen will stir the dam continuously, like like you're making. From an egg, you want to make it into, I don't know, chavita, whatever you want to do. So you continue stirring the dam, so it shouldn't become possible being nikrash. Ademakrav leila tadir, and then go ahead and be makrav, let's say the korban tamid, for example. The hademakrav shena tadir. And then you pick up the dam from that kohen for the eno tadir. We gave the example of Musaf, and then you go ahead and do the avoda of the zrikas adam, etc. with that eno tadir. Amar Afuna Misura, Toshma, let's learn it from our Mishnah. Shlomim shel emesh, right? It's got yesterday's shlomim. Chatas v'yoshim shel hayom, shel emesh kodem l'shel hayom. Now the Gemara is going to be medayek. That ha diyom dumya di emesh. That it's only because the shlomim was purely a shlomim shel emesh, and therefore it has a certain urgency. It's yesterday's shlomim, and that will give it preference over a korban chatas or an osham. However, the yom dumya di emesh, what happens if it wasn't yesterday's shlomim, but it was today's shlomim? And he should have shechted the chatos and the asham, but instead he shechted the shlomim. The implication of the Mishnah is in that case, he's got to freeze, which means give over the dam to the other Kohen to be Mares, and he's got to start with that which is Kodesh, which is a greater level of Kedusha, in this case, Chatos v'yoshim. Then he comes back to complete the Shlomim. The only reason that the Mishnah says otherwise is because it was the Shlomim shel Emesh. Hechi Domi, what would be the case of Shlomim shel Hayom, where Chatos v'yoshim would take preference? The Kodem Shachti Shlomim. He mistakenly gave preference and he started by shechting the Shlomim. And in such a case, Chatos v'yoshim Kodme. So we now have an answer to our question. When a person violates the law of Tadir, or for that matter, the law of Kodesh, and he went ahead and he shechted the carbon, which is not Tadir, it's not Kodesh, he's got to stop everything. Unless it was Emesh. So the Gemara rejects. Dilma, perhaps your diuk is not a correct diuk. Shlomim di emesh, v'chatos di osham di yom, hechi mishkachas. What's the case? We thought that the case was he did all the preparations for the Shlomim yesterday. He hasn't yet begun the chatos v'osham of Hayom. And that's why Shlomim gets preference. Shlomim shel Emesh. No. The case is the shachtinu l'chavayim. He went ahead, he shechted both karbonos. The carbon Shlomim of Emesh and the carbon chatas and oshim of today. So where's the dam? The dam of the Shlomim is being memoras by one Kohen, Kohen A. The dam of the chatas oshim is being memoras in the hands of another Kohen, Kohen B. And in such a case, the Mishnah says that since you started the shechita with the Shlomim, then the zrika should follow through. And even though you went ahead and you shechted the chatos, but nevertheless, since you shechted the Shlomim first, you've got to finish up the avoda and do the zrikas adam of the Shlomim. Avolo shachtinu l'chavayu. But let's say he only shechted the Shlomim, and he hasn't yet shechted the chatos. Here's the para l'chatos. The bull is alive and well. It's kicking. Tiboilach, here I don't know. What should I do? Because on the one hand, he already shechted the carbon Shlomim. Just 1 second. If he shechted both of them, then avalo shachtinu. One second. You know what, Steve? I think I'm missing the logic here. I thought I understood this very well, but now I think at a second time I don't have the logic here. If he shechted both of them, so then he should go ahead and continue with the Shlomim. But if he didn't shecht the Asham or the Chatas yet, he only shechted what? He only shechted the Shlomim. Then we're going to go ahead and tell him to shech the Asham? Why is that so? 1 second, maybe he'll clarify, because I see this is counterintuitive. If the person shechted today's Shlomim and the Chatas Asham is still alive, so he hasn't shechted yet the Mor Kodesh, So then we can't do this, the mumares of the shlomim while we have to sacrifice another offering. So what's the logic here? That since he already shechted the shlomim, but he hasn't yet shechted the korban chatos. So again, when do we say that the shlomim gets preference? That's only because he shechted both. I see what he's saying. He's saying we paid homage, to the asham or the chatas by doing the shechita. So then, you know what? Since we did the shechita of the shlomim yesterday, so we'll continue with the shlom. We're not insulting, in inverted commas, the asham or the chatas because we already shechted them. But in a case where we only shechted the shlomim, and now you have the chatos and the asham begging to be shechted, so to speak, because they have kodesh, they have that element and superiority and first preference of kodesh, then at least go ahead and do the shechita. And then once you go ahead and do the shechita, while you're stirring up the dam from the shlomim, then maybe you might as well go ahead and do the zrikas adam of the chatos and asham. Toshma, dover acher, we're going back to the case of kiddush, that becomes the paradigm. Birchas hayayin tedira, birchas hayom ena tedira. Right, we're going to start with Bar Priya Gofen because that's a frequent bracha, as opposed to the extra kedusha in the bracha of Makadish Shabbos and Tadir Shein Tadir Koder. Now, what happens? He doesn't have any yayin on his table at this moment. It's Shabbos, right? The sun set and it's Shabbos. So at this point in time, you can pit one against the other. There's the tadir of Bar Priya Gefen and the kodesh of Makadish HaShabbos. And we're going to apply the principle now of tadir v'sheni tadir kolim. Basil says that you make the Bar Priya Gefen first. So that if you have something that's mekudash, but it's not tadir, then obviously we're going to give preference to that which is tadir, despite the fact that you have kodesh. I think it's clear. Let me go over it one more time. What the Gemara is using now, kiddush as paradigmic, as a model, is because in kiddush you have the Mekadesh Shabbos, which is kodesh, that has the superior element of kedusha. Bar Priya Gofen is tadir, and we're going to paskin that tadir trumps kodesh. Therefore, we're going to say the same thing by analogy in the case of karbanos. If you have one carbon which is tadir, but the other carbon is kodesh, then we're going to give preference to the tadir. So tadir can even override kodesh. The Gemara answers no. Hachanami, what's the deal? The deal is not that he's chayiv in kiddush when the sun sets on Friday. No, he's not chayiv in kiddush until they bring out the wine. Hachanami kaven de asyon. Once it's Shabbos and they brought out the yayin, kiman de shchiti chavayu dami. It's as if he shechted both of them. Right? And we said before that if he shechted both of them, that's a whole different story. And you can't prove anything. He says by the time one is ready to recite Kiddush, the wine has already been brought before him. Therefore, if we compare this to a case involving karbanos, it's analogous to a situation with both karbanos were slaughtered and awaiting zrika. And in such a case, tadir v'sheno tadir, tadir kodem. So we understand very well why Bar Priya Gofen Kodesh Beis Hillel will come first, because he's got both Shabbos and Yayin on the table. And therefore it's comparable to a case in which he shechted both karbanos. And in the case where he shechted both karbanos, there's no question that Toder v'shani Toder Koder. So I guess the concept of, again, like we said before, there's almost like a psychological element here of not insulting someone. So since he's got the wine in front of him, we don't want to insult the wine. And if we already shechted the carbon, we don't want to, we don't want to insult that which is tadir. So we're going to make the bar priya go for first. Toshma. Let me just see what time it is. Oh boy. At least hopefully we'll get to the next mission. That was really paramount in my mind. Toshma, the Omer Rabbi Yochanan, halachim ispal odom shel mincha v'yakach shel musafim. Right? He didn't bring. He didn't daven musaf in the morning hours. Now it's time for mincha, and Rabbi Yochanan Paskins said, "I'll daven mincha first because mincha is tadir. It's the whole week long." So what do we see? That even though musaf is more kodesh, nevertheless, tadir v'sheni tadir kodesh. The Gemara answers, "Hachinami came to batisman tfilos mincha command the shchiti travayu dami." It's already entered into the time of mincha, and therefore mincha is begging to be davened, so to speak. It'd be an insult not to daven mincha. It's like we said before, if you shechted already 2 korbanos, then for sure tadir v'shein and tadir kodem. So Rabbi Yochanan is comparing mincha and musaf in the afternoon of Shabbos to 2 korbanos that were already shechted, and therefore tadir kodem. Amalei Rav Acha Breder of Ashir Ravina Toshma. Let's quote a Mishnah. Now we're in Pesachim. He tells you here it's in Samach Aleph. This is the second half of Pesachim, Masechta Pesachim. Shchato kodem chatzos. Now, he should have waited for the shchita of the Korban Pesach till the afternoon of the 14th. He was makdim, and he shechted it in the morning hours of the 14th, and the korban is possible. The Torah says, Bein ha'arbayim. Now, what's the pasuk Bein ha'arbayim? He tells you to look in Shmos Yud Beis. Okay, Parshas Bo we don't have time to do that now, but in theory, we would find that the Zman of Shchitas Korban Pesach is Bein ha'arbayim in the afternoon, not in the morning. So therefore, this Shchita and the korban is possible. It's called Pesach Shalom Bisman, right? However, now we have another case. The Mishnah says Kodem L'Tamid. In other words, in the afternoon of the 14th, he has 2 chiyuvim that achal simultaneously. One is the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim, and the other is Korban Pesach of Bein Arbayim. He should have given preference to the Korban Tamid. Why? Because Tadir v'shein Tadir kodem. For some reason, the Gemara is not operating with the principle of Hashlama, which means that the Tamid always has to be the last korban of the day. Okay, that's a problem, but not for us. Okay, so now he went ahead and he shechted the Korban Pesach before the Tamid, which is Tadir, is kosher. The korban is kosher. Okay, you violated the law of Tadir, but it doesn't invalidate the korban. But yet, he's going to go ahead now, freeze the Korban Pesach. Someone is going to stir up the dam, and now he's going to pick up the Tamid and be makriv the Korban Tamid. Why? Because Tadir v'sheinu Tadir Kodesh. Now, presumably, the Korban Pesach is Kodesh Yosef, right? Because if you don't bring Korban Pesach, you chayv kares. So you see that even though the Korban Pesach should come later than the Tamid, just 1 second, Korban Tamid, kosher, v'yemamaris v'lam. Right. So it means that even though he started the process of the Korban Pesach, which is Kodesh, but nevertheless, since Tadir v'shein Tadir kodem and Tadir trumps even Kodesh, therefore he has to stop the Korban Pesach, freeze everything, do the Mamaris Adam, etc., and now go ahead and do the Korban Tamid, because Tadir v'shein Tadir kodem. So Gemara says, no. That's fine. Because Tadav Shein and Tadav already shechted the carbon Tamid first. And then apparently he went ahead and he shechted the carbon Pesach. What does he do? He shechted the carbon Pesach. That's Kodesh Yoser, but he already shechted the Tamid. So that's what we said before, over and over again, that if he shechted both karbanos, then Kuliyamala Pligi, it's a Davar Poshet and Pshita, that Tadav Shein and Tadav Kodesh. So therefore, he's going to give the dam of the Korban Pesach over to the other coin to be Mamaris Saddam, while he continues with the avoda of the Tamid, because Tamid is Tadi. Omalei Rav Acha Sabel Rav Ashi Masnisa Nami Deika. I could be medayik this from the Mishnah, support this pshat Ketoni Ad Sheyizrok Hadam. Below Ketoni Ad Sheyishchot Vi. Yeah, he should have added the word Ad Sheyishchot Vi Yizrok Hadam. Shmamino, we see that the Mishnah is dealing with a case where he already did the shechita of the Karban Tamid. Otherwise, it should have said Ad Sheyishchot. The fact that he omits the Ad Sheyishchot means that he already did the shechita of the Karban Tamid, and therefore we certainly have two shechitas, Kodesh and Tamid and Tadir, and we always, in that case, we clearly, according to everybody, that's not a suffix, we apply the principle of Tadir Shein and Tadir Kodesh. Ubekulan Kohanim Rashoim. Okay, this is a whole nother discussion, that the Kohen could eat the basar of chatos or asham and shlam in any way he sees fit, roasted, cooked, and overcooked and everything. My timer, what's the basis for this? Amakra limashchal igdula kidech shemalachim ochlim. Right, just like a king can eat in any way he wants, whatever he desires. He can tell the chef to grill it, to barbecue it, to cook it, whatever he wants. So too, with regard to the achilas hakarban of the kohanim, the basar karban, it's ligdula, mashchal ligdula. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. Let's see if at least we can start the Mishnah. I don't think we'll finish the Mishnah, but Omer Reb Shimon, in Ra'isa Shemen Shu Mischalek Ba'azara. Okay, we'll have to see exactly what the case is, but they're divvying up the shemen of the karbanos for the kohanim, and it's all taking place in the azara. Ein tzarich l'shol mahu, ela mosar rekike minchas Yisrael, v'log shemen shel mitzvah. In other words, there are only two cases, says Rabbi Shimon, where they divvy up the oil from the karban amongst the kohanim. It's either a case of a karban mincha, and we have what's called Mosar Rekike Menachos, we'll figure out what that is, or this is a more simple case, Log Shemen Shel Mitzora. Right, in the case of Taras Mitzora, they have to bring a Log Shemen, that's a certain volume of oil, and as part of the Tara process of the Mitzora, they take the oil and they sprinkle it 7 times towards the Kodesh Kadoshim. They apply to the right ear, the thumb, the big toe, and anything that is shirayim that's left over in the lug shemen is now divided up amongst the kohanim. And in the case of Mosar Rekike Menachos, so you have here a parsha at the beginning of Vayikra called Minchas Mafet Tanur, an oven-baked mincha offering, and it's subdivided into 2 categories. There are loaves and wafers. In each of these, as well as all other mincha offerings, the Torah requires the addition of a log of shemen. However, as the entire log of shemen was mixed with flour of the loaves, the wafers were baked without oil. After baking the oil, they smeared the oil. After baking the wafers, they smeared the oil on the wafers, and that's called rikikim. Rikikim are the wafers, and the remaining oil, which is not necessary to smear on the rikikim, that is divvied up amongst the Kohen. But if you're talking about shemen that's actually burnt on the marocha of the mizbech, and it's don't even ask what it is. Ella, it's either mosar rikike minchas kohanim, or it's mosar minchas kohen Moshiach, and Rabbi Tarfon Omer misnadvim she'ein misnadvim shemen, or Rabbi Tarfon Omer misnadvim shemen. Okay, so Mirza Hashem will try to pick this up tomorrow. Take this opportunity to wish you a Freilich Chanukah, and hopefully we'll be able to continue even during Chanukah, I hope.